Paul Ryan, your host of the ATB Fantasy Show. If you're new to the show, thank you for joining us. And to our regular listeners, welcome back. Back from his 1 week hiatus as the best co-host in the world, Dave, a.k.a. Mr. Pigskin Papers Hartman. Dave, how are you?
I'm doing well, Paul. I'm not down in Texas like you, so I'm not boiling over. But I'm
Dave, where can we find you on Twitter, sir?
Yep, I'm at Pigskin Papers. Both of the P's are capitalized, and my website where I post all my content is thepigskinpapers.com.
Yes, sir. Guys, I'm Paul Ryan. You can find me on Twitter at Paul_Ryan15. Well, Dave, we missed you last week. It was part one of our division breakdown, and former show host and your SFB 13 league mate, Rich Mileto, stopped by to discuss the AFC North. Guys, be sure to follow Rich on Twitter at FantasyBosco. Well, here we are with part two of our division breakdown, and we're staying in the North, but we're moving over to the NFC. With us tonight is another great guest, NFL, NBA, and WNBA analyst and writer for ESPN. Ladies and gentlemen, please welcome Mr. Eric Moody to the show. Eric, how are you?
No, things are going pretty good. Like, as you mentioned, Paul, about weather in Texas. I'm in Texas, in the North Texas area. It's very hot, 100+ degree days, but I'm keeping cool. I'm excited. It's summertime. We're getting closer to the NFL season, and things are really going to start to pick up here in a couple of weeks with training camp and preseason. Yeah. But there's a ton of fantasy football articles and contents out there, and podcasts and live streams like this one. So I'm looking forward to diving in.
Absolutely. Well, Eric, where can we find you on Twitter, sir?
Yeah, everyone can find me on Twitter at Eric N. Moody. And so that's my handle on really all social media platforms, Twitter, Instagram, and TikTok. So if you're not following me already, stop what you're doing and go do that. And obviously listen to this show as well. So,
all right, Moody, well, let's go ahead and get after it, sir. I'm curious, how long have you been playing fantasy football?
Oh, wow. Great question. For me in fantasy, I think we've had a relationship for getting close to 20 years now. And so I've always been like a huge NFL fan, growing up, but I never ended up playing fantasy football. So once a very good friend of mine, just asked me, hey, I know you're a big NFL fan. Have you ever played fantasy football? I said, I haven't, but I'm open to it. So he invited me to his league, and I was immediately hooked.
Oh, yeah. That's exactly how it goes, man.
Yeah, you guys make me feel young, make me feel old because I'm coming up on 30 years playing fantasy football. Moody, what inspired you to start creating fantasy football and betting content?
Well, I had a Twitter account really for a long time, but I never really used it. And so I always talked about, the NFL and fantasy football, with other people, whether I was at work, in the lunchroom or on breaks, you're just walking around, social events, you go out with friends, go out with family. So I was constantly talking about it. So, I just decided, hey, I just want to rebrand my Twitter account just really to focus just on the NFL and just focus on fantasy football and share my opinions because I was always very open and just wanting to help people. And so this was another way that I could help people, by giving them that advice and putting them in a position to, win their league. And so I think what ended up happening, thinking back, was, so I had the Twitter account. And so it was a website. They don't exist any longer. So, but it's Fantasy Football Locker Room. That was the website. So they just reached out. They sent me a DM on Twitter. And they just asked, hey, have you ever thought about creating content? I said, I haven't, but it is something I wouldn't mind doing, and things just kind of started from there. So,
very cool, very cool. Yeah. So you mentioned Fantasy Football Locker Room. Was that in addition to that site? Was there another site or company that you worked for before working with ESPN?
Yeah, there were a lot of websites. I felt like it's probably not a website out there that I haven't written for. So just funny thinking back. So really with that opportunity at Fantasy Football Locker Room, that led to opportunities to create content for Gridiron Experts. And that led to an opportunity with Fantasy Pros because if there were places that were looking for content creators, I would just put my name in the hat because I didn't want to write for multiple places. And, spent a number of years at RotoViz as well, fantasy data. Did a little bit of work with Dynasty League football, 4 for 4. And, I was able to do quite a bit with The Athletic, creating content and doing podcasts and different things like that. And that kind of transitioned on to Pro Football Network. And then finally at that point, that's where I joined ESPN. And it'll be 2 years this September. So
congratulations.
That's great.
On that,
I was going to ask you sort of how you got that opportunity at ESPN, but you kind of just explained that. But can you tell us a little bit about what your role is at ESPN and the different kinds of content you are creating over there?
Yeah, no, I can do that. And so, my title, I guess the best way to put it is like on-air talent and writer. So I'll create like written content, audio content, video content, really revolving around the NFL, NBA, and WNBA from a fantasy and sports betting perspective. But, I've also had an opportunity, as well, just to appear on different shows. I've appeared on the Fantasy Focus, football show, Fantasy Football Marathon. I've hopped on Daily Wager, this just in, and an ESPN Bet. And so it's kind of like a combination of a lot of different things. Really revolves around audio, video, and written content. But I've also done some stuff on ESPN Radio as well. So that's kind of in a nutshell the role and kind of what I do on a day-to-day basis. So
sounds fun, and it sounds busy. It sounds like there's a lot, kind of a lot of balls in the air all the time for you.
Yeah, no, absolutely. Especially with covering all three sports. It's not really like a down period. So I know those that just focus on fantasy football, at the end of the fantasy football season, they'll be like, all right, well, fantasy football's done. I guess I'll shift my focus, to the draft and just wait till it gets busy again. But immediately after fantasy football ends, like I'll still keep the betting content up. It's the NFL playoffs and you got the draft coming up. So it's a component there. But then, I have to shift my attention to the NBA because that, it's a very long season, with, 82 regular season games in the postseason. And now the WNBA is in full swing. And then the fantasy content will obviously pick up more in July. So it's always something going on, but I've always been really good at time management. So it just really comes down to kind of time blocking and siloing what you need to do to get it all done. So
excellent.
Yeah, well, recently Moody, the crew at ESPN did a mock draft, and I found it interesting because you took an approach that most people don't use these days, and you went running back heavy with this mock draft. Can you talk to us a little bit about that?
Yeah, I can do that. Yeah, my usual strategy just revolves around using like positional tiers. So I love positional tiers because it really allows like the decisions that are made in the draft, like to dictate, the players that I'll end up selecting. And that's just really in that draft how it fell to me when I was looking and using my positional tiers. But one thing that I noticed like in drafts, and I've done a lot of mock drafts and we'll do more with the ESPN team, but I just like to do them in general, is that I think it's a ton of viable running backs available like in rounds like 3 through 7. Like in case someone does want to go like wide receiver like heavy. I mean, you got Najee Harris out there, Ramondre Stevenson, Miles Sanders, J.K. Dobbins, Aaron Jones, Isaiah Pacheco. Those are just some names that are kind of off the top of my head. But I always like using positional tiers. If someone out there that's watching or listening does not use them, I highly encourage you to do so. But it's a lot of different ways to win your league. So that's what makes it so fun, right?
Absolutely.
Yeah, I'm a big fan of doing mock drafts also, and with the Scott Fishbowl drafts coming up soon, I've been doing a bunch of those, and they come out very different every time because the board just you don't know where the board is going to head, and especially in a super flex.
Yeah,
I think it just makes it more complicated. So as Paul mentioned at the top of the show, we're going to focus on the NFC North today, which I think is a pretty interesting division this season because for the first time in 15 years, you don't have Aaron Rodgers in the division as a starting quarterback. And, I was looking back. The Packers are the only team in that division that's not only won a Super Bowl this century, but since 1985.
Yeah.
Right. So it's a little bit of a championship-starved division. It's kind of, I like the NFC North. It's kind of like the Rust Belt, some really old NFL teams like the Packers and the Bears and the Lions, teams that have been around for a really long time. Chris Berman, who probably became the first like household name at ESPN as an anchor, used to call it the NFC Norris division because the NHL used to have a Norris division that had the Blackhawks, and the Red Wings and the Minnesota North Stars in it. So
Mhm.
it's kind of not a big glamour division, but there's definitely a lot of interesting fantasy assets in that division, even with Rodgers out of the division. So we'll start with the Vikings, who won the division last year by winning a ton of one-score games. And we could save that conversation for another day about whether the Vikings were a mirage or not. But as I think we all know, as everyone knows, they recently released Dalvin Cook. And so Alexander Mattisson, who ably filled in for Cook on multiple occasions in the last couple of years, whenever Cook got hurt, now, suddenly finds himself as the presumed number one RB, number one running back there. Eric, what do you think about him this season? And do you think he's sort of a value at his current ADP or not?
Yeah, whenever I think of Alexander Mattisson, like I do believe that he's still like a value pick. And it may just be some uncertainty with him actually being in this RB1 or starting role. And he's had a stellar track record. I'm like, this is a player who's averaged a remarkable 23.3 touches and 20 fantasy points per game in 6 games without Dalvin Cook. And you look at the Vikings, they've really shored up their once troubled offensive line, which is a good sign. All 5 starters were selected within the first 2 rounds of 5 consecutive drafts. So I just look at the stage being set for someone like Mattisson to really seize a massive opportunity here. Making him a hot commodity, in my opinion, in fantasy drafts. But I think it's important. I just think for everyone to have realistic expectations. Like the Vikings are going to be a pass-heavy team. Kirk Cousins could accumulate close to 600 pass attempts in 2023. So I think someone like Mattisson could see anywhere from 250 to 260 touches. And that still makes him, in my opinion, a solid RB2 in fantasy.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, you look at that Vikings offense. You mentioned Kirk Cousins and the passing attempts, and just overall, the Vikings offense compared to the rest of the division. Is there a chance for Alexander Mattisson to potentially be the highest scoring running back in this division?
Yeah, that's a great question. My gut says no. I don't see that happening. I just see someone like Aaron Jones, scoring the most, fantasy points out of all the running backs in the division. I'm like, speaking about Jones, I'm like, he's a great value in fantasy drafts right now. I think he's someone that does have the potential to finish like as a low-end RB1. One thing about Green Bay, I'm like, they do boast a formidable offensive line. I'm like, this is a unit that ranked like 8th in run block win rate, really showcasing their ability to open up running lanes effectively. And one thing about Green Bay, I'm like, they have made significant investments in bolstering their offensive line in recent years. And in my opinion, it's really paid off. I'm like, I'm talking about Aaron Jones, but look at A.J. Dillon too. Like, both of them really reaped the benefits behind this unit. I'm like, they accumulated nearly 1,900 rushing yards last year. And one thing about Jones, I'm like, he ranked 7th in rushing yards before first contact. Then among running backs with 150 or more rushing attempts last season, he also had the 5th highest success rate. So you got Jordan Love that's under center now. Obviously, they're going to want to lean a little bit more on the running game and be more balanced to help him out as much as possible. But one thing about Jones, like, he's averaged 16.2 touches per game like over the last 3 seasons. So I think fantasy managers can really expect a similar workload in 2022. So I really love Jones like as an RB2, and I do believe that he can end up being the top scorer in this division.
Interesting. Let's stick with Minnesota for a minute. Adam Thielen is finally gone as the Vikings' number 2 receiver. They of course added T.J. Hawkinson middle of the season last year, and he really emerged as the number 2 target in that offense behind Justin Jefferson, who, he's number 1 on fantasy boards this year. But they drafted Jordan, number 1 receiver, that is, on fantasy boards. But they drafted Jordan Addison, who it would appear has a really nice opportunity. KJ Osborne, he's flashed at times, but hasn't really stepped up that much as someone who you'd think of as a wide receiver too. It's not a division that has sort of great depth at wide receiver on most of the teams in the division. So do you think that Addison could immediately step in and be the best second receiver on his team in that division?
Yeah, my initial thought is yes. I just look at Addison thinking that I think the stars have really aligned for him in 2023.
Yeah.
I'm like, just look at his Vikings team. You know, they drafted him in the first round to really address a key offensive need. And one thing about Addison that I like, I'm like, he's an exceptional route runner. It really makes him a prime target for favorable opportunities, and really in one of the league's like top offenses. You've got Justin Jefferson. Everyone knows about him and really the attention that he commands. So I look at someone like Addison. He really has a chance to excel, really like play in and play out, really all season. While I don't think his production will match, say, Jefferson's rookie numbers, I don't think it's going to be that epic. But I think that Addison could like assume a similar role that Jefferson had, like when he replaced Stephon Diggs, like in 2020. I think about Adam Thielen, where you mentioned him. And I mean, this is a player, when you take Adam Thielen out, like in Addison, I'm like, he could get close to 100 or more targets and really make a significant impact, like in the Vikings, like passing attack. So I'm looking at Addison as someone that's more so like a flex option with upside. I just wouldn't be comfortable rolling with him as my fantasy wide receiver too. Those are my initial thoughts. So,
Okay, that's fair.
yeah,
You look at, kind of sticking with the Dolphins, not the Dolphins, excuse me, the Vikings here, and Kirk Cousins. He's the guy leading the way, and he's been an underrated fantasy asset himself. Consistently being a QB1. But another team in this division that's made strides offensively is the Detroit Lions. Well, when you look at Kirk Cousins and Jared Goff, who do you prefer in fantasy in 2023?
yeah, I actually prefer Kirk Cousins here. One thing about Cousins and Jared Goff, like they do have a similar ADP, but Cousins has more upside in my opinion. I mentioned it a moment ago. The Vikings, should continue to be a very pass-heavy offense.
Yeah.
And one thing about Cousins, I'm like, he's got, 3 great receiving playmakers. We mentioned Justin Jefferson. He's got Jordan Addison, obviously. He's got TJ Hawkinson. And one thing about Cousins, like since 2019, I'm like, he's been solid. Like he's averaged 18.5 fantasy points per game. And if I'm in a super flex format, I'm like, he's one of my favorite like QB2 targets. I'm even open to having Cousins as my QB1, like in a single quarterback format. I may just have another quarterback on my bench just to kind of play matchups if necessary. But I think Cousins is well positioned for success. I'm like, he could finish easily as a top 10 to top 12 fantasy quarterback. So.
Yeah, which he's done pretty much year in and year out the last few years. And it's funny, Paul, that you asked this question about these 2 quarterbacks, because in my main league, which is a 14-team league, last year I waited on QB and I ended up with Cousins and Goff. With Cousins as my one. And after there were 2 weeks where we sat huge weeks from Goff while Cousins was on the road, I started platooning them. Yeah. They were both significantly better at home, and their schedule kind of worked out that it seemed like whenever one was home, the other one was on the road. And I actually ended up 4th in quarterback points in that league. Only the guys with Hurts, Allen, and Mahomes ended up with more points than me with those 2. I like both of those quarterbacks. I liked them both last year. I like them both this year. I agree with Moody that Cousins is a little ahead of him, But just focusing on Goff for a second, I think when they made that trade, the Stafford trade, people kind of thought maybe Goff just didn't have it, even though he had been to a Super Bowl, and that he would just kind of keep the seat warm in Detroit until, as they inevitably would have a very high draft pick, they would draft a quarterback. But now, Goff had a very good year last year. Do you think this is sort of a make or break, plant the flag kind of year for him? Or do you think he's sort of proven that he's the guy there?
I would say I do believe like it is a make or break year for Goff. It's it's complicated. I think the best way to tackle this is, one thing with Goff is that he's under contract with the Lions through the 2024 season. I'm like, they're in the midst of contract negotiations right now. Not too much information on that front, but we do know that conversations are taking place. I just think my big takeaway is that I think it's important for Goff to have like a great season just in order to follow up his solid 2022 season, just to show that consistency. But he's got Ben Johnson back in Detroit, as the Lions offensive coordinator. I know he had some interviews. They thought he may end up leaving, but he's staying, which is good. And one thing about Goff, he had 4,438 passing yards and 29 touchdowns last season. If you're looking at it in fantasy, he finished, as like a QB10, I believe. And so I just think it's important for Goff, given his supporting cast, like in Detroit, to have another great season. And it could end up really positioning him for like a future contract with his team for down the road. And we'll see what happens. Perhaps this could be a Super Bowl, a legitimate, I would say, Super Bowl contender, depending on how this season goes.
Yeah, I would say making the playoffs, I think, is very important for him.
Yeah,
this year, and then we'd see how he does in the playoffs. But I think it sort of has to start there.
Yeah,
for him.
You mentioned Jared Goff being under contract until 2024 and showing some consistency being important for Jared Goff. But when you look at what he's done with this Lions team and what he did with the Rams, should Detroit consider making Goff their franchise quarterback, Moody?
I believe they should. Now hear me out here. So
okay,
I would say finding like adequate quarterback play in the NFL, I would say, is a difficult task. I think the contract that Daniel Jones received from the Giants last season would be a good starting point for Goff and the Lions. You look at Goff, he'll turn 29 years old this year. But I think keeping Goff as their starting quarterback really keeps the Lions, I guess, their Super Bowl window open, I would say, for another 3 to 4 years. And again, I mentioned before, he was great last season. But I think if you were to isolate like what he was able to do over the final 11 games, it's really impressive. He would throw for 18 touchdowns with just one interception, a 66.7% completion rate, finish in the top 10 in passing yards and touchdowns. Had fewer interceptions than Patrick Mahomes, Josh Allen, Justin Herbert, and Joe Burrow. So I'm not saying that Goff is like on the level of Patrick Mahomes, but I think he's a lot better than what people think. And I do believe with this roster that the Detroit Lions have assembled right now, they could be legitimate Super Bowl contenders, like with Goff and the other offensive playmakers that they have, and then this defense. So I believe that they should make Goff their franchise quarterback.
Let's stick with the Lions and Goff's favorite target. One of my favorite players in the league is Amon-Ra St. Brown. He was a 4th-round draft pick, and for 2 years he's just been proving every team that passed on him 3 times very wrong. And he proved last year that he's no fluke. And his current expert consensus ranking, I like those better than ADP. So his ECR right now is wide receiver 9 in both half PPR and full PPR. Curious what you think about that ranking. Too high, too low, just about right?
Yeah, I believe it's just right. He's one of my favorite targets at his average draft position right now. Last season, you look at St. Brown, he finished 9th in the league with 146 targets. He was 6th in receptions, had 106.
One thing I'd mentioned that
he averaged 16.7 fantasy points per game. I think which is huge. You've got Jameson Williams. He's suspended for part of the season, and so St. Brown will be a key playmaker for the Lions. And really, opposing defenses really won't be able to contain him. As you mentioned, he's proved a lot of people wrong. He's very talented. He's great in the open field. Yards after the catch. He's your guy. And one thing about the Lions, though, they have really one of the most favorable schedules, I would say, for wide receivers this upcoming season. So St. Brown is firmly on the wide receiver 1 radar.
Well, the 3 receivers who are, I agree with everything you said about him. The 3 receivers right behind him right now in expert consensus rankings are Garrett Wilson, Jalen Waddle, T. Higgins, and then Chris Olave.
Okay.
I personally, I think, would take St. Brown. It's close with some of those, but I think I would take him ahead of all 4 of those guys. Do you feel the same way?
I do, and I'm a huge fan of Garrett Wilson this year. Have the same feelings towards Chris Olave, but I think one thing that'll really separate Amon-Ra St. Brown from those other players that you mentioned is just think about the number of targets that he's going to amass, like with Jameson Williams out. And so for that being, on the front end of the season, and in fantasy you're trying to get off to a fast start, he's going to deliver some monster performances with this schedule. So Amon-Ra St. Brown would get the edge, but I'm a huge Garrett Wilson, second-year breakout guy. Pains me to say that, but I would go with St. Brown.
Well, that's why they're just one apart, in ECR. They're both nice targets. If you miss one, you get the other.
The Lions had a pretty busy offseason, Moody, and they shook up the backfield. Jamal Williams leads the league in TDs last year. They let him walk, and they bring in David Montgomery, and then they use a top 15 pick on a Jahmyr Gibbs, who's an electric player receiver out of the backfield, and then they trade away DeAndre Swift. You look at this Lions backfield, is it the best in the NFC North?
It's really close between the Packers and the Lions, but I'm going to go with Detroit because of their offensive line. This is a unit that dealt with numerous injuries last season, but the Lions, offensive line, was still able to showcase its talent. They ended up ranking 9th in run block win rate. This is a group with 3 first-round picks and a Pro Bowler. This offensive line is top-notch at 4 out of 5 positions. And you mentioned this. Detroit had a solid, rushing attack last year. They ranked 13th with 28.2 rushing attempts per game and 11th with 128.2 rushing yards per game. We all witnessed how productive Jamal Williams was in Detroit last year. Great pick in fantasy, really exceeded expectations. Had a career year, especially due to Swift's injury troubles. But one thing about Williams, he led the league in rushing touchdowns, like you mentioned. But looking ahead, you've got, Gibbs and Montgomery. They're going to share the workload for the Lions, but I think that places both of them really on the RB2 radar, in my opinion. So I think they're being overlooked in drafts. So it's close between Detroit and Green Bay, but I do believe the Lions have the best backfield in the division.
So, Paul, you mentioned David Montgomery leaving Chicago, going to Detroit. That opens the door for Khalil Herbert. They also drafted Roschon Johnson, Bears I'm talking about now. I think the best running back there is Justin Fields, so that factors in as well. But, Moody, I'm curious what you think about the Chicago running backs in a redraft league. Say, are you targeting them? Or I see Khalil Herbert on the board in the 8th or 9th round. And that kind of looks tempting, but then I just don't know what to think about that backfield. What are your thoughts about Chicago backfield?
Yeah, it's really difficult to have confidence in the Bears backfield. You kind of hit on a lot of points. Khalil Herbert's there, Deontay Foreman. You got Johnson that's there. You got Justin Fields, who's going to command a high number of rushing attempts. But I will say, I am very open to drafting Johnson as a lottery ticket. And one thing about him, he's an efficient rusher. He profiles physically as a 3-down back, and he's also solid in pass protection. This is someone who played with Bijan Robinson at the University of Texas. He had 47 career games, only 5 starts, but still managed to rank 18th on the school's all-time rushing list with 2,190 rushing yards on 392 attempts, 5.7 yards per carry. So he has the potential, I would say, to be a fantasy football league winner, just depending on how the backfield breaks down in Chicago. But also, just as the season progresses, who knows? They may just ride the hot hand, and that hot hand could be Johnson. And he could be someone that you pick up at the tail end of your draft who helps you win your league in 2023. So,
yeah.
I like that. Yeah.
People have been questioning Justin Fields as a passer. Even showed, you kind of see him last year at times that maybe even the team didn't really believe in Justin Fields as their quarterback, and you hear the rumors of potentially targeting a quarterback with the number 1 overall pick. And of course, we saw Chicago trade that pick to Carolina, and they acquired DJ Moore. The fantasy community is indifferent on DJ Moore. To you, what are your thoughts on DJ Moore this year? Is he a buy or sell for you, Moody?
Yeah, for me, I would say DJ Moore is someone that I'm buying. You mentioned about the offseason changes. So the Bears upgraded their receiving playmakers in 2023. I look at someone like DJ Moore, someone who should command, at least 100 or more targets. And so I think many are making the assumption that the Bears will remain a run-heavy team. But it is possible that they end up leaning a little bit more on Fields as a passer in 2023. One thing about Moore, he's totaled at least 1,150 receiving yards or 7 touchdowns in 4 consecutive seasons. So I'm looking at Moore as someone who's a solid low-end wide receiver 2 or flex option. He's just not a player I'm aggressively targeting in drafts because I have seen his ADP, depending on the size of the league and how those are drafting within it, anywhere in the 4th round I've seen him go in some leagues. So he's more of an option I would look into more at the 5th or 6th round. Again, not someone I'm aggressively targeting, but if he's there, I'm very open to drafting him ideally as my flex option. So
yeah.
So we'll go back a couple years. 2020, Josh Allen going into his third year. The Bills bring in Stephon Diggs. Allen makes the leap. 2022, just Jalen Hurts going into his third season. The Eagles bring in A.J. Brown, and Jalen Hurts makes the leap. 2023, the Bears, Justin Fields going into his third year, the guy we just talked about. They bring in DJ Moore, a guy who can be a wide receiver one. I'm not saying he's Stephon Diggs or A.J. Brown. Mm-hmm. Obviously, the Bears are hoping for the same kind of lightning in a bottle. Do you think that can happen? Like, do you think that that the addition of they also added Chase Claypool last year, and that didn't really use him much. But can DJ Moore do for Justin Fields what those other elite receivers did for those other quarterbacks?
Yeah, no, I do kind of see, some of those parallels, but I just don't think that DJ Moore will have the same effect as, say, like Stephon Diggs had on Josh Allen. But one thing about Moore, it doesn't mean that he can't be productive. I'm like, he could still see anywhere from 110 to 120 targets and finish with around 1,000 receiving yards. I still see the Bears as a run-heavy team, but I do believe they'll still lean a little bit more on Fields as a passer. I just don't think the ceiling is going to be as high or explosive as, say, Stephon Diggs catching balls from Josh Allen.
Fair enough.
Well, we've talked about what the Bears have done to help Justin Fields this year. When you look at Fields, I mean, of course, we know what he is as a rusher, but do you see him as more than just a mobile quarterback, or do you think he's actually a good passer as well?
Yeah, I do believe he's a good passer, and I think we'll see more of that in 2023. But here's the reality: if we're looking at this from fantasy, I'm like, Fields' fantasy value is tied heavily to his rushing ability. I'm like, Fields average only 149.5 passing yards per game in 2022. I do see that increasing, but I could just see him averaging around 220 to 230 passing yards per game this year. Again, not a significant increase, but still enough of an increase to show progression as a passer, I would say. Yeah. It's probably the best way to put it.
Yeah, so following up on that, because I think right now Justin Fields is certainly one of the hottest commodities, kind of looking at this coming season. And it's kind of funny if you think back to last year, because people who drafted him were dropping him after about week 3 or 4, because it was horrible. What was, the way the Bears were playing offensively. And then all of a sudden, I don't know if they let him start running or he just decided, I need to start running. And then we saw what he did. He was, the QB1 over about a 5 or 6 week stretch until he got hurt.
It's glorious.
Was just putting up numbers like even Lamar Jackson wasn't putting up the kind of rushing numbers that, Lamar at his peak in 18 and 19 as a runner wasn't putting up the kind of numbers Fields was putting up during that stretch last season. So now coming into this season, his ECR right now is the QB6. Are you kind of buying at that value? Do you see him potentially being a top 5 QB in fantasy this year?
Yeah, I don't see Fields finishing as a top 5 fantasy option. I do believe that he'll finish like as a top 10 fantasy QB. I just believe like 6 to 10 is probably going to be a more realistic range, in my opinion.
Yeah, and it's hard. I think it'd be tough to get him at that, sort of the equivalent round value as like the QB8, because I think just people have seen the way the game has changed and the way like what Hurts did last year, with all the rushing touchdowns, and what Fields did when he got hot last year. And I think he'll be off draft boards before you're going to take him, and probably before I'm going to take him also.
Yeah.
Yeah, Dave mentioned earlier in the show that Green Bay has made a change at quarterback, and they're going to hand over the reins to Jordan Love. And earlier today, Moody, you had a tweet about sneaky quarterback 2 options, and this guy was on your list. I'm referring to Jordan Love. When you look at him, I mean, is he a sneaky option in Superflex leagues?
Yeah, I believe so. Like one thing about Love, he's got a very good arm. He's also mobile. I just think fantasy managers are feeling a bit queasy because there isn't much data to go on. It's nothing really to analyze. He's only attempted 83 passes since entering the league back in 2020. But one thing about the Packers, I mentioned this earlier. I'm like, this is a Green Bay team that has a solid offensive line, so he should have ample pass protection. They've also done what they can to surround Love with playmakers. He's got Christian Watson there. He's got Romeo Doubs. So he's got pass catchers to throw to. And so I just look at Love. I'm like, he has little risk at his ADP. It's really all upside and worth a shot, especially if you're drafting in Superflex formats. So I do see him as a sneaky QB2 option. I'm like, who knows? I'm like, he could possibly even finish as like a top 16 quarterback. It's just, it'll be curious to see how things unfold for Love because I am very, very high on him and optimistic. So
definitely, likewise.
So you mentioned, I guess, the presumptive top target there, Christian Watson. And Watson, like Fields last year, was a waiver wire darling. And I know because I benefited from that. And I know Paul's a Cowboy fan. Moody, I don't know, living where you live, if you're also a Cowboy fan. But Cowboy fans will remember the beginning of the Christian Watson breakout last year because it was that amazing 3-touchdown game, and then he just started scoring every week. Obviously, he doesn't have Aaron Rodgers anymore, and Rodgers didn't go back to him immediately after the first pass Rodgers threw last year was like a beautiful 75-yard rainbow that Watson dropped. I don't know if you guys remember that.
I remember that.
His NFL career started.
It's painful.
So what do you think about Watson for this year with Love under center? His current ECR, his expert consensus ranking is wide receiver 27. So he's not that expensive. Does he have upside to be like a top 15 wide receiver this year, just with his rare combination of size and speed, or what do you think is a realistic expectation for Christian Watson this year?
Yeah, I don't see Watson finishing like as a top 15 option. I think he'll finish just inside the top 20. Even though like Watson emerged like as the Packers' #1 wide receiver last season, I'm like you were alluding to it and mentioned it. We all watched like with awe. Like he ranked 12th in yards per route run and 3rd in fantasy points per route run. Very productive. Scored a ton of touchdowns, which obviously elevated his fantasy value. I just think that'll change in 2023. May not score as many touchdowns, but my bigger concern with Watson really boils down to, is he going to get enough targets to really propel him into the top 15 fantasy wide receivers? I don't believe that he will, because he does have Romeo Doubs that's there. A lot of buzz surrounding Doubs with, being Love's, #1 guy.
Go-to guy, yeah.
And so, but who knows? I still think Watson's the #1. I'm just concerned about the targets. I think top 20 is a little bit more realistic in my opinion.
Yeah, and they could be, you alluded to it before, with the line they have, a new quarterback coming in, and the 2 running backs they have. They could also just be pretty run heavy, more run heavy than they've been, in the LaFleur era there, where they had Aaron Rodgers. So I think I agree with you. I don't think he's a top 15 guy, but the talent is there.
You mentioned Aaron Jones earlier, thinking that he could finish as an RB1 again this year. But, another player in that backfield, A.J. Dillon, is someone who people have kind of soured on, but we've seen his potential as well. If you had to pick one of these guys strictly based on their ADP, who are you going with this year, Moody?
Yeah, I would end up going with Aaron Jones. I know many fantasy managers wanted desperately for A.J. Dillon, to break out. But Jones is still very productive, and we saw a lot from him, especially as a receiver out of the backfield. And so I still think he'll get a lot of touches, and he's someone that I would rather see fantasy managers prioritize than A.J. Dillon. And so I would go with Aaron Jones here. I think he's a great value. He's someone who's readily available, just depending on the size of your league. Like I've seen him go as late as like the 4th round. Usually like the 3rd round tends to be the sweet spot. But I think he's someone who can easily exceed expectations. So.
Okay, so we've talked about all 4 teams in the division now, and I think we certainly talked about all 4 quarterbacks, and I think we've touched on, kind of the major fantasy assets on all 4 teams. So overall, Moody, if you had to pick one team in the NFC North that you're sort of sweetest on for fantasy, that you might find yourself, hoping you come out of the draft with a little more exposure to one team in the division, which one would it be?
Yeah, this may come as a surprise to many people, but it's actually the Green Bay Packers, and here's why. What I like about the Packers players in fantasy is that they're all really good values right now because it's a lot of uncertainty in Green Bay. No Aaron Rodgers, you got Jordan Love. So all these players that we talked about, like Jordan Love, Aaron Jones, Christian Watson, A.J. Dillon, I'm like, they're really afterthoughts in the minds of fantasy football managers right now, which creates opportunity. But one thing the Packers have really one of the most, I would say, the easiest schedules from a fantasy perspective. They have obviously a ton of games against their the other teams in their division in the NFC North, but they also face the NFC South as well. And so with that schedule and some of these playmakers on the team, I think at the end of the day, when the dust is settled in the 2023 season, I think you'll have some players or some managers that are like, you know what, I should have had more Packers like on my team.
Yeah,
that answer does surprise me, but I follow your logic. I think that's an interesting and thought-provoking answer.
Yeah. Best ball being all the rage the last couple of years, Moody. Do you have a favorite quarterback wide receiver stack in best ball leagues from this division?
Yeah, actually, I've got two. So I love the combination of Justin Jefferson and Kirk Cousins. I'm like, given their relative ADPs, it's something that if you have an early pick that you can implement. But I also like Kirk Cousins and Jordan Addison too, who's obviously available later. For the Lions, Amon-Ra St. Brown and Jared Goff is one that I like quite a bit. The ADP scenario pans out, but just think about the fireworks that these two players are going to create, especially the early part of the season where Jameson Williams is out. So I know those are some stacks that I'm a huge fan of, in best ball. So
absolutely.
So we've talked a lot about players that you're high on for this year in this division. Are there one or two players that at their current draft value you're a seller on that you think are just too overvalued and won't live up to their ADP?
Yeah, it's I guess one that comes to mind is like Khalil Herbert. I've seen his ADP kind of fluctuate, but he's just not someone that I really want like on my teams. I would say if you're looking at it from like just a dynasty lens, just given his contract situation and age, obviously now is a good time to kind of sell high on Aaron Jones. But those are just two players kind of off the top of my head that come to mind once you ask that question. So,
all right, Moody, we're getting close to the end of it here. We can't end the show without a bold call. Give me your bold call NFC North edition, sir.
I'm gonna go back with the Green Bay Packers here. So I would say the Green Bay Packers surprise everyone and they win at least 10 or more games.
Oh, I like that. You're high on the Packers. I like that because a lot of people, I don't know, they're like you said, they're so the unknown with Jordan Love, I think, has people shying away from that situation.
Paul, do you have a bold call for this division, Paul?
No, I was letting Moody take over. He's a professional here, so I didn't do too much research tonight. How about you, Dave?
Well, mine, I do have one, and it kind of, I think, fits with Moody's because my bold call was going to be that the Vikings, who won the division last year, finished third this year behind the Lions and the Packers. I mean, I just think there's got to be some close game regression for them. They just won every close game they played last year, except for the playoff game against the Giants. That's where it kind of ended. Yeah. I do like a lot of the players on their team. I don't think they did enough to address a bad defense and a defense that they couldn't count on in the playoffs. So I don't think the Vikings are a bad team, but if they finish 8-9, I won't be surprised. And I don't think that'll be good enough to finish ahead of either the Lions or the Packers.
That's interesting.
It's not that bold, but that's my bold call.
Yeah.
All right, off the top of my head, I'll say this. My bold call, Jahmyr Gibbs has 70 receptions his rookie year. How about that?
I like it.
Okay. Eric, I can't thank you enough. Excuse me, Moody, I can't thank you enough for coming on tonight. You mentioned earlier the content you're creating and, working for ESPN, of course. But again, just reminding people what can they expect from the soft season and where they can find it.
Yeah, no, I'll be happy to do that. And I would just say again, just everyone, just follow me on all social media platforms at Eric N. Moody. All of my NFL, NBA, and WNBA content is available on ESPN.com. I do have a fantasy football article that should be published tomorrow, which ended up being Thursday. That highlights players who benefit from good offensive line play. So I dove really deep on the offensive lines for this article on any additions that they have, players that they left or that left the team, how they performed last year from a film perspective, but also I looked at some advanced metrics as well, and just really to identify running backs. And it's a list of running backs that I want really on all of my teams, or at least have some exposure to. And so that'll end up getting published for tomorrow. But if everyone is active, on social media, I think one thing that kind of separates me from others that are out there is I'd love to interact with my following. So always try to answer as many or reply to as many comments as possible, and also answer as many questions as possible. So I think that's important. You got a lot of people we're all part of this fantasy football community, and a lot of people have questions, want to share their opinions, and so I'm really all about that. So a lot of my tweets are very thought-provoking and always kind of ask for responses, and so I always try to take time out each day to respond to those. So if you're looking for another fantasy football follow that engages with his audience, I'm your guy.
It's very nice that you do that, because not everyone does. So on behalf of the fantasy football community that's out there, thank you for engaging with your followers.
Oh, yeah.
Again, thank you, Moody, so much for coming on tonight. Dave, before we wrap things up, let the people know where they can find you on Twitter.
Yep, at PigskinPapers with both P's capitalized. My website is thepigskinpapers.com. I'll have a new article out by the end of the week. I did my first set of redraft rankings, and it's the players I had the most trouble ranking. So look for that.
I like that. Yes, sir.
We talked about at least one of them tonight. So,
well, I'll definitely be on the lookout for that, guys. I'm Paul Ryan. You can find me on Twitter at Paul_Ryan15. We appreciate you joining us, and we'll see you guys next week.